Ducate Corinthian wasn't always the man we see today. Once, he was a promising student of philosophy, someone who was genuinely interested in understanding the human condition. He had spent his youth reading the works of great thinkers, analyzing their writings, and searching for meaning. But somewhere along the way, Ducate had lost his way. The lure of material wealth, the power that came with manipulation, and the temptation of easy victories had become too much for him to resist. As he built his reputation online as a life coach, his real talent became clear. He had a knack for identifying the vulnerable. Ducate would prey on those who were lost, offering them hope wrapped in vague, lofty ideals. He would use his charm to persuade people to follow him, promising that if they just listened to his advice, they too could find success and happiness. As Ducate's online presence grew, so did his list of conquests. He reveled in the power he held over others, manipulating their emotions to get what he wanted. But as with all those who seek dominance over others, there comes a point when the prey becomes aware of the predator. It started innocuously enough. Ducate began receiving cryptic messages from an anonymous user. At first, he thought nothing of it. Strange messages were common in his line of work, especially from people who didn't have the courage to reveal their identities. But these messages were different. There was a certain elegance to them, a rhythm that seemed to suggest they were not written by a typical follower. "Do you know what it means to be truly alone?" the first message read. Ducate had scoffed, dismissing it as the ramblings of a desperate person. He had no time for such nonsense. But then the messages continued. Each one was more cryptic than the last, filled with riddles and strange phrases that hinted at a deep, hidden knowledge. There are things in this world that you cannot understand. You believe yourself to be above it all, but there are forces at play that will bring you to your knees. Despite himself, Ducate became intrigued. Who was this person? Why were they so fixated on him? His curiosity got the better of him, and he began responding, hoping to unravel the mystery behind the words. The conversation that followed was unlike anything he had ever experienced. His usual charm and manipulation had no effect on the sender. They remained cool, detached, as though they were toying with him. Days turned into weeks as the back and forth continued. Ducate found himself more and more drawn to the enigma on the other side of the screen. He tried to dig deeper, searching for clues in their writing that might reveal their identity, but every time he thought he was getting close, they would slip away, leaving him more confused than before. And they believed him. Why wouldn't they? He spoke with authority, always appeared calm and in control, and seemed to have an endless supply of testimonials from grateful clients. But what they didn't see was the man behind the mask, the one who used them for his own gain. Then, one day, the sender finally suggested they meet. By this point, Ducate had become obsessed. He had to know who this person was. He convinced himself that this was just another game, one that he would eventually win. The sender provided an address and a time, both of which seemed odd. The house was in a part of town Ducate wasn't familiar with, and the meeting was set for a late hour. He hesitated briefly, but the thought of walking away from the mystery was unbearable. When the day arrived, Ducate found himself standing outside the address provided, a large, decaying mansion on the outskirts of the city. It looked as though no one had lived there in decades. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. He felt a chill run down his spine, but he ignored it, telling himself that this was just part of the game. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He pushed it open, and the door creaked ominously as it swung inward. The air inside was stale, and the house was dark, save for a faint light coming from somewhere deeper within. As he stepped inside, his footsteps echoed eerily in the empty space. He called out, but there was no response. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Ducate followed the light, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows shifting around him as though they were alive. Finally, he reached the room where the light was coming from. It was a large, dimly lit parlor, and there, standing in the center of the room, was the woman he had been communicating with. She was dressed in a strange, almost childlike costume, a yellow onesie that seemed completely out of place in the dilapidated mansion. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Ducate felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as though he had seen her before, though he couldn't place where. She smiled at him, but there was something cold and unsettling in her eyes. As they began to speak, Ducate tried to regain his composure. He attempted to charm her, to steer the conversation in his usual direction, but nothing he said seemed to have any effect on her. She remained calm, almost amused by his efforts. Then, without warning, she began speaking in a low, hypnotic voice. Ducate felt his body tense as the words washed over him. There was something otherworldly about her voice, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "You've spent your life feeding off the misery of others," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You take, but you give nothing in return. You think you're untouchable, but you've been blind to the truth." Ducate opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He felt as though he were trapped in some sort of nightmare. His body wouldn't move, and his mind was clouded with confusion. She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "The people you've hurt, they're not just victims. They're part of something much larger. You've been playing with forces you don't understand." And then she said something that made Ducate's blood run cold. "Tonight, you will meet the consequences of your actions." Before Ducate could react, she raised her hand and snapped her fingers. The room seemed to blur, and Ducate felt a strange pulling sensation, as though he were being sucked into a void. When Ducate regained his senses, he was no longer in the mansion. He found himself standing in a vast, empty landscape, the sky above him an unnatural shade of red. There was no sound, no wind, just an eerie, oppressive silence. In the distance, he saw figures emerging from the mist. At first, he couldn't make out who they were, but as they drew closer, he realized with growing horror that they were people he had wronged over the years. Their faces were twisted in anger and pain, their eyes burning with hatred. One by one, they began to speak, accusing him of the harm he had caused them. Their voices echoed in his mind, growing louder and more insistent until Ducate could no longer bear it. He tried to run, but no matter how fast he moved, the figures seemed to close in on him. They reached out for him, their hands grasping at him, pulling him down into the mist. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. Just when he thought he was lost forever, the woman's voice echoed through the darkness once more. "This is your fate, Ducate. You cannot escape it." Ducate awoke, drenched in sweat, lying on the floor of the mansion. The woman was gone, but her words still echoed in his mind. He stumbled to his feet, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. As he made his way out of the house, he realized that something inside him had changed. The confidence he once felt was gone, replaced by a deep sense of dread. He could no longer charm or manipulate others as he had before. His words rang hollow, and people no longer looked to him for guidance. Over time, Ducate's life began to unravel. His followers abandoned him, and his once thriving business collapsed. He was left with nothing but the haunting memory of that night and the knowledge that the woman's curse had stripped him of everything he held dear. And so, Ducate Corinthian became a shadow of his former self, a man who had once preyed on the weak, now living in fear of the forces he had so foolishly underestimated.